There is a gravestone in Istanbul. It is probably 200 years old. It belongs, almost certainly, to someone's ancestor, and the person standing in front of it cannot read it, not because the stone is worn, not because the inscription is damaged, but because the language carved into it, the language that person's great-great-grandparents spoke, wrote, argued in, prayed in, and loved in, is now as foreign to them as Latin is to an English speaker. They would need years of specialized study to understand a single sentence under the stone above the bones of their own family. This is not an accident. It is the direct result of a decision made by one man in 1 year that most people outside Turkey have never heard of. And understanding what was lost and what was deliberately severed requires going back to a world that no longer exists. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire wrote in a script based on Arabic letters. Not Arabic the language, Ottoman Turkish, which sounded completely different and had its own grammar and logic, but Arabic letters, adapted and modified to carry Turkish sounds. This was the Perso-Arabic script, and it had flowed across the Islamic world for centuries. It was the medium through which Ottoman civilization recorded its laws, its poetry, its medicine, its philosophy, and its ordinary human life. Letters between merchants, imperial decrees, love poems, tax records, the collected works of poets whose names are still famous across the Middle East. All of it flowing right to left in a script that required years to master properly, and which, at its peak, carried one of the most sophisticated literary traditions in the world. Divan poetry, the high art form of the Ottoman courts, lasted 700 years. 700 years of poets developing a shared symbolic language, so intricate that a single line could carry a dozen simultaneous meanings. The rose was the beloved, the nightingale was the poet, the garden was the world, which was also paradise, which was also a place full of thorns. These layers were not decoration, they were a technology for expressing human experience in ways that plain speech could not reach. And all of it was written in that script, flowing interconnected letters that changed shape depending on where they appeared in a word. Letters that encoded not just sound, but centuries of accumulated meaning. Then, in 1928, a man decided it had to stop. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had already done the impossible. He had taken the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, a civilization humiliated by World War I, carved up by European powers, declared finished by the rest of the world, and forged it into a modern republic. He abolished the Sultanate. He abolished the Caliphate. He changed the calendar, the legal system, the dress codes. He was building a new Turkey from the ruins of the old one, and he had decided, with total conviction, that the old script was part of what had to go. His reasoning was not irrational. The Arabic-based script was genuinely poorly suited to Turkish sounds. Turkish has 8 distinct vowel sounds, and the Arabic script handled vowels ambiguously at best. A reader was often forced to guess which word was meant from context. One example researchers cite: the phrase for Mehmed became a pasha, and the phrase for Mehmed Pasha died could be virtually indistinguishable in written Ottoman Turkish. You might spend your whole life reading and still stumble. Atatürk wanted a script that matched the spoken language exactly, and the Latin alphabet, with a few modifications for Turkish sounds, could do that. In June 1928, he established a commission. Their task was to create a new Turkish alphabet. The commission did its work and then proposed what seemed like the obvious approach: a gradual transition. Both scripts would be taught in schools simultaneously, and newspapers would run both versions side by side. A period of maybe 5 to 15 years would allow the population to adjust, so no one would be left behind. Atatürk heard the proposal and then said something that changed the course of a civilization. He declared, either in 3 months or not at all. His logic was that if people have access to the old script, they will keep reading the old script. A slow transition is no transition. The new alphabet would only take hold if the old one was made to disappear. So the commission was told 3 months. The law passed on November 1st, 1928. By December 1st, every newspaper had to print in the new letters. By January 1st, 1929, all public communication, every government document, every school, every sign would use only the Latin alphabet. Books printed in the old letters were forbidden from publication after the year's end. And just like that, every person in Turkey who had learned to read, who had spent years acquiring a skill, who had used that skill their entire lives, became, in the eyes of the state, illiterate. This is the fact that most tellings of this story skip over, because the official narrative of the reform focuses on literacy rates going up. And they did go up. The government established nations' schools across the country, mobile classrooms that opened in villages and city squares. Atatürk himself toured Turkey with a chalkboard, personally demonstrating the new letters in public parks. He was called the Basogretmen, the head teacher. Within a decade, the percentage of Turks who could read the new script had roughly doubled. The reform worked in the narrow sense of its stated goal. But here is what the official story requires you to not ask. What was the literacy rate before? The 1927 census conducted by the new Republican government reported that roughly 9% of Turkey's population was literacy. 9%. That number became the foundation of the reform's justification. The Arabic script was failing the people. The new alphabet would liberate them. Except historians have spent decades pointing out that this number has serious problems. The 1927 census measured literacy in the Latin alphabet, a script that had not been introduced yet. It was counting people who could read a writing system that didn't officially exist. Earlier Ottoman records suggest very different figures. Between 1908 and 1914, the daily circulation of Istanbul newspapers alone exceeded 100,000 copies. Professor Kemal Karpat, working from Sultan Abdul Hamid's records, estimated Ottoman literacy in 1894 at over 50%. A Polish count who visited in 1814 wrote that, except for the lower class, almost everyone knows how to read and write. In 1851, an English visitor wrote that, except for Great Britain, he had never been somewhere with more literate people than Turkey. These numbers are contested. Historians disagree. But here is what is not contested. Whatever the literacy rate actually was in 1927, it collapsed to zero in the old script the moment the law took effect. Every person who had ever learned to read Ottoman Turkish, and there were millions of them, was functionally cut off from every book, every document, every newspaper printed before 1929. One Cambridge researcher studying the social experience of the reform used the phrase functional illiteracy to describe what happened to educated Ottomans overnight. They had not become illiterate in any general sense. They could still think, they could still speak. But the practical use of their literacy, the ability to access the written culture they had grown up inside, was gone. Now imagine what was inside that culture: 700 years of divan poetry, the 10-volume travel memoir of Evliya Çelebi, a 17th century writer who wandered the entire Ottoman world and recorded everything he saw: architecture, food, dialects, customs, the particular way different cities smelled. 600 years of imperial archives, medical texts, legal codes, personal correspondence, the private letters of ordinary people to their families. All of it sitting in libraries and archives across Turkey, sealed behind a script that within one generation, almost no one in the country could read. Today, Turkey holds 186,000 registered Ottoman manuscripts. They are physically present, the paper has not burned, the ink has not faded, but they are as inaccessible to the average Turkish citizen as a Latin manuscript is to someone who has never studied Latin. A young person in Istanbul who wants to read a poem by Nedim, one of the great poets of the 18th century, a man who wrote about that same city they live in, has to learn what is essentially a foreign script to access it. Most never do. But the story doesn't end with the alphabet. This is where the story arrives at something almost absurd. Atatürk's most famous speech, the Nutuk, the great 36-hour address to the Grand National Assembly in 1927, the founding text of the Republic, has had to be translated into modern Turkish not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each translation became necessary because the previous version had grown too archaic for ordinary readers. The words of the man who demolished the old civilization in order to build a new one have had to be continuously remade because the civilization he built has already moved so far from his language that his original words have become opaque. The reformer became unreadable to his own reform. Now, I want to be honest about something because this is where people making this argument usually go wrong. Atatürk's reform was not a simple act of destruction. The Arabic script genuinely was clumsy for Turkish sounds. Literacy did increase. Women who had never been allowed near a mosque school gained access to education for the first time. A country that Europe had written off emerged as a functioning modern state, and the language reform was part of how that happened. The people who made these decisions were not villains. They were people who had watched their civilization nearly destroyed by the old order, and who believed with complete sincerity that the break had to be total. The question is not whether Atatürk was wrong to do what he did. That debate will continue in Turkey for as long as Turkey exists. The question this story is actually asking is something different. What do you lose when you cut a civilization off from its own past? Not the past that historians reconstruct and translate and place in museums. The living past, the past you could walk into just by opening a book. The past that exists in your grandparents' handwriting, in the inscription above the door of the building your family owned for 200 years. In the poem your great-grandmother could recite from memory in a language you will never hear her speak. In Turkey today, a person can stand in front of a gravestone and not know whose values, whose prayers, whose final words to the living are carved into the stone in front of them. They can visit a library that holds manuscripts no one has read in a century, not because they are forbidden, but because almost no one alive can. The script changed, the words changed, and in the space between the civilization that was and the civilization that became, something disappeared that cannot be recovered by decree. Not the bronze of a bell, not the stone of a cathedral, just the ordinary miracle of a person being able to read what the people before them wrote. The ability to reach back across time and hear a voice that was trying to speak forward. That thread was cut in 1928, and the people standing in front of those gravestones today are only beginning to understand what they are not hearing.